I do want to take a minute and say that before we dive into the video for this project and see how we got to these results, this is one of my least documented or well documented projects to date. I really wanted to concentrate on what I was doing with the painting while it was happening. This is the first time I've ever done painting with a spray gun and compressor before rather than like a rattle can. So, to give myself a little bit of a break and just concentrate on the task at hand, I wasn't as concerned with setting up tripods and documenting every single step. But hopefully, I'll circle back at the end of the video with some information and talk about those individual steps after I kind of show what I was able to capture. Take a quick minute and pause right here and give a little bit of a project update. So I think I'm just moments away from being able to actually lay my first coat of primer on the engine bay. I've got most everything taped up. I'm gonna throw a tarp or something to cover the rest of the car up top, but I've got everything sanded down with 320 grit. I've washed the engine bay. I've pressure washed the engine bay probably 3 times now. I've gotten everything taped up. I went over the entire car with a product a local paint guy recommended called Semsolve, which is sort of like a wax and tar remover. It's a little more potent than that. It will dissolve a little bit of paint, so you definitely don't want to use that on like a color coat or a clear coat. But you can use it on raw metal and especially paint that you're planning on painting over momentarily anyways. You can see I have my wiring harnesses wrapped up here, and then I actually ran a string up to my light just to kind of keep them up and away and not touching anything inside here, so I don't have to move them around. Once I start painting, this would be my first time doing it ever, so I don't want to have to fuss with anything else other than just concentrating on what I'm spraying. I masked up some tape around the edges, so I'm really just trying to define an area that I'm going to paint. For a lot of the firewall stuff, I do have foam blocks blocking up some of these holes. I am going to try to throw some paint down inside this channel, which is the, it's basically where the hood cowl sits, and that's where the HVAC system draws in air over here. This was filthy dirty. The car had a smell to it, so I want to lay fresh paint down. That way, when I put the HVAC system back together, there's no remaining smells. Everything's fresh, nice, clean. This process took me a while to get here. I've probably been working on this over the last week. Even before that, I was backing the car out, pressure washing the engine bay, pulling the car back in, drying everything off, starting to sand stuff down. I'm definitely not aiming for like a perfect show quality finish here, obviously. I'm gonna leave all the factory holes as is, even if I'm not using them. I'll probably just plug them up with like, bolts or plugs later if I find that they're just empty holes. I'm not welding anything over in this process either to smooth out the engine bay. I'm just, trying to do sort of an OEM plus restoration here. So I will be doing the headlight harness and AC harness wire tuck, and hopefully clean up the engine bay just a little bit that way. Really just doing it for purely aesthetic reasons. All right, well, here it is. I've got the engine bay painted and clear coated, and I have to say, I'm pretty happy with how it turned out. So let's back up and start at the beginning. This thing was a total mess. It was just covered in dirt and grease and God knows what else. So really the first step to this entire process was kind of just stripping everything out of the engine bay and then really, really deep cleaning it. I pressure washed this engine bay probably 3 separate times. In between a couple of those times, I kind of sanded everything down with like 320 grit sandpaper. After washing it with Dawn and some citrus degreaser, try to remove as much of the grease and dirt as possible. Then sanding it down with 320 grit to try to remove any surface imperfections and smooth out areas between raw metal and rust that was showing through, and smoothing out those transitions between the paint. I've sprayed and I covered up, rust spots with some rust stopper, and also on the raw metal spots I hit it with self-etching primer to really seal in that rust from coming back and creating a surface that the paint could bond to. Most of that was kind of concentrated here on the firewall. There was some rust and maybe some spots down below. Everything went down okay. The only stuff that I think I would do differently is I think I would do a third base coat. I feel like there are just some areas where I see a little bit of shadowing, like definitely in these deeper parts where it's harder to get the paint done, and sort of on the back side of the shock mount pillars. You can see there's not 100% coverage back there. So I think a third base coat would cover that. And then what also happened, I was just about to finish the clear coat and I was coming across here as like my final pass. And when I got to about here, laying it on really thick so it looked nice and glossy, I bumped into the air filter, the moisture filter that was coming out of my air compressor. And since this is sort of crappy plastic, this just snapped off. So I lost my moisture filter and air just started shooting out of the compressor tank and right as I was just about to be finished. So we quickly got the broken piece of plastic out of here and just put the airline back in and let the compressor charge back up, just so I could get that last couple of 2 feet of what I needed to do. And I got it down pretty glossy. Now, just even minutes after I finished and turned the compressor off, there I can see I already got a bug landed in the clear coat there. And then there's just some tiny like dust specks here and there. There's also some areas where I could have gone a little thicker with the clear coat. It's really hard while you're in there spraying this to kind of see the coverage level. All you can really tell is you can kind of see here, maybe, if I can get the light to reflect on it. This kind of looks like a drier texture than say this, which is a little bit glossier. So when you see that drier texture, that's where you didn't have like a thick enough clear coat as far as I can tell. But I think I got the most visible part once the engine's back in, transmission, all the wires, shocks, everything, bolts back in place. You're really just gonna see, kind of this section here and the front and this section here. And I'm pretty happy with those sections. I was able to get paint and clear coat into the sort of air ventilation area underneath the hood cowl. So this is all fresh and clean, and I won't have to worry about any of those odors from the old car, I'm calling it now, kind of coming through, because this is the new car. This is the brand new car. So after everything in the engine bay was completely sanded down with 320 grit, when I was ready to lay the primer, I went through with a rag and I wiped down the entire surface with this product called Semsolve. This was recommended to me by a local auto paint guy. It's a adhesive residue wax grease road tar remover. It sort of smells like kerosene to me, but I went over the entire engine bay and really cleaned off any remaining oils that were going to keep the primer from sticking. Now, as far as the primer goes, this is what I used for the primer. And again, I went to a local auto paint store, and there's a place called Ray's here in Los Angeles. Been there since 1983. Ray, who works there, was happy to walk me through every part of the painting process very patiently. Me being a first timer, didn't really know where to start. So shout out to Ray's Paint in Culver City. So this is the high build primer he recommended. It's a 4-to-1, so that means 4 parts primer to 1 part hardener. And if you just do the straight 4-to-1, that gives you a high build primer, so a very like thick imperfection filling primer that you do need to sand down quite a bit if you're really trying to get a smooth surface. In the case of the engine bay, I wasn't extremely concerned with how perfect it looked because I know a lot of it's going to be covered up no matter what. So I went 4-1-2 with a reducer to make the primer a little bit thinner and more of like a, I guess it's the difference between something being a little softer and more sandable to something be like a harder shell. So that's what I went with. So I really wasn't concerned about doing any post sanding much at all. And I laid the primer down, and it kind of, it was more of a sealer. So after laying the primer down everywhere, I did 2 coats of primer. I let it cure for about a week just because I didn't have time to paint the same day, and I only get a chance to work on this car on the weekends. After it was primed, I went over everything with this gray scuff pad. It's really flexible, and it's the right grit just for roughing up the surface of the primer, just to scuff it up so it's ready to receive the paint. As far as the paint goes, I went with the stock paint color. This is Honda NH538 Frost White. That's what the Civic hatchback was originally, so that's what I was using for my base coat. The paint gets mixed 2-to-1 ratio, so 2 parts paint to 1 part reducer, and that's what I used to spray 2 base coats. So I did try to paint kind of everything that was exposed here. I even painted the bumper rail and the radiator brace down here as well. They're not really going to be seen, but you know, there was enough paint in kind of each load of the gun to do this entire surface. So I even painted like, you know, what was exposed. It's going to be covered up by the fenders, mostly just to kind of freshen it up and seal it in, so I know, you know, no surface rust is going to come back through anytime soon for this. So I even painted all the way up to the door jambs here. That'll probably get sanded down when I kind of try to blend it into the doors and the body eventually. And then removed the windshield wiper, motor, and all this stuff. And just kind of really freshened everything up. So that was 1 base coat, let set and dry for about 10 minutes, followed by a 2nd base coat, let and set dry for about 30 minutes total before starting the clear coat. And this is the clear coat that was recommended to me again by Ray. So this is the actual clear coat itself, and this is the activator. This gets mixed 4 parts to 1, so 4 parts clear coat to 1 part activator. Now spraying the clear coat was the part that I was the most nervous about, just because I wasn't sure how easy it was going to be to control, how runny it was going to be. I was very worried about getting runs that I would then have to like go back and wet sand out and polish out. I really didn't get any runs. I took my time. I've been using rattle cans for years, and I'm kind of used to seeing that moment when a surface goes from a little rough textured like this to the hyper glossy, and kind of knowing when to stop before you get a run when the surface is saturated and makes that glossy coat. So I took my time. I did 2 coats of clear. After the base coat dried for 30 minutes, I did 1 coat of clear. Then I a little bit lighter. Then I waited for 10 minutes, and then I circled back with a 2nd coat of clear and went heavier as I went, making sure every surface kind of glossed up to a nice wet look before I moved on to the next part. This is the spray gun that I used. I got this at Harbor Freight. It was about $25, probably under $30 total. It worked pretty well. I think this is, on the cheaper side for these guns, but it's pretty basic controls. It did the job well for what I needed. Um, I mostly didn't mess with the paint flow or the airflow. I controlled the PSI at the compressor level. Um, and then the only thing I really adjusted before painting was this is the um, paint fan knob, like the spread of the paint pattern. So I did try to dial this in based on a couple of videos I saw on Paint Society about how to get the right paint spread. The gun itself comes with a single paint hopper. I found this okay. It's really opaque. You can't see through it at all to see, how much paint is really left in there as you're going. These things also need cleaned pretty thoroughly after every use so they don't get clogged up. So what I found was a better option was you can get disposable paint hoppers at Harbor Freight. So whether or not you choose to clean and reuse these or just dispose of them afterwards, I found these to be more clear and also disposable, so you didn't have to stop and clean these out between every coat of paint, which is sort of a limited amount of time when you're talking about cleaning a gun and mixing up your next batch of paint within 10 minutes before your next coat. So I found these to be helpful. This is about $7 or $8 for about 5 of them. The most interesting and useful piece of information I learned during this project was how to use one of these Easy Mix mixing cups with the ratio charts on the back. So for example, if you're mixing a paint, say the clear coat that is a 4-to-1 ratio, well, each one of these is labeled for 2-to-1 or 3-to-1 or 4-to-1. So if you're mixing a 4-to-1 ratio, you just go to the 4-to-1 chart, and then how high you fill the first column just determines the overall amount of paint you're trying to lay down or amount of clear coat you're trying to lay down. So for example, if I want to mix up a lot of clear coat, I may fill this first column in the 4-to-1 ratio up to the 4 level. That just means I'm just doing a bigger amount of overall paint. But then to get to the 1 ratio, I would fill it 1, 2, 3, 4 up to the 4 line with my clear coat, and then for the activator I would just fill it up to the next line that corresponds with however many parts in the first column I'm using. So to get to the 1 ratio in the 1 column, I would fill this 4 in the 4 and then just up to the number 4 in the 1 column. So that means I have 4 parts of clear coat and 1 part of activator. Similar to that, you can use the other ratio columns as well. So for example, if you want to do a high build primer, that's what my primer was. It was just a base primer of 4-to-1 ratio. So you do the same thing up to 4 and then 1 with the hardener. So 4 parts primer, 1 part hardener. But then I mixed it down to make it more of a sealer rather than a high build primer. So then you can use the other ratios like 1/2, 1, or 2. So if I'm doing a sealer primer, I want to do 4-to-1 to 2. So it would be primer, hardener, reducer up to the number 2. If I only wanted to do half that total amount of paint, I would follow the same ratios in the same columns, but I would just fill the lines to the 2 lines instead. So if I only wanted half as much paint, then I would fill the first column to 2, and then I would go to the next 2 with the hardener. So that gives me still my 4-to-1 ratio, but it's only 2 parts overall. And then again to the next 2 if I was doing the 4-to-1 to 2 ratio. It's a little confusing at first, but once you just know that you just have to hit the next line, and these increments down below are only the total amount of paint you're trying to mix, it makes a lot more sense and makes this a pretty invaluable tool.